Big Lovely Day about incest.
Tasty.
I know. Pornhub certified section of the book for sure. It's the section where the despot gets caught in the laundry machine and the despot's sister finds him. I think that's how it goes.
Stepsister.
It's been a while. It's been a while since I've read it, but I'm pretty sure that's the story at this point, is the story of the despot and his sister. All right. Well, let me get Audacity recording and we'll go ahead and kick off now that we've got the stream running and things going. Again, sorry I've missed the last like week or two have been wild for me. So apologies that I've been a little bit less than on point with it, but yeah, we're getting there. We're getting there, I think. Whew. Yeah. All right. Well, I guess I thank all of you for coming. I'm going to go ahead and kick us off. I thank all of you for joining us today at the Deleuze and Guattari Quarantine Collective's ongoing reading of Anti-Oedipus. Today we move into 3.7. One sec. Oh, God, I moved past the page. The Barbarian or Imperial representation. Not going to do any major announcements today. Just going to push us a little bit towards, pardon me, push us a little bit towards asking everyone to please join into more groups. We've got so many going now, and I know Ben, the DAO group, I think, is finished off, and you're moving on to new text soon, which I think is exciting. We've got so many things happening, so please check our calendar, check our setup, and join in the chat. Any major things that anyone wants to go over before I move on, feel free. Now would be the time.
We should be slated to start the introduction to Black Skin, White Masks this Wednesday at 12.
Fanon, the Fanon group. Fanon?
Mm-hmm.
Is it Fanon or Fanon?
I'm not sure. I say Fanon.
All right. Well, that's one of my favorite texts. I may have to join that.
Please do.
Yeah. All right. With that, I think I'll go ahead and push forward, and we'll go ahead and begin reading 3.7, Barbarian or Imperial Representation. Before we dive in, remember we have moved into the despotic, talking through the way that it has co-opted the filiative and the alliance. The way that the despot operates takes on the last few lines are worth reading, and then I'll dive right in. To read, come on, text. Thank you. This infinitivization cannot be understood exactly as Nietzsche would have it, that is, as a consequence of the interplay of ancestors, profound genealogies, and extended filiations. Rather, when these are short-circuited, abducted by the new alliance and direct filiation, then the ancestor, the master of the mobile and finite blocks, finds himself dismissed by the deity, the immobile organizer of bricks and their infinite circuit. Now, finally, moving on. Incest with the sister and incest with the mother are very different things. The sister is not a substitute for the mother. The one belongs to the connective category of alliance, the other to the disjunctive category of filiation. Incest with the sister is prohibited insofar as the conditions of territorial coding require that alliance not be confounded with filiation, and incest with the mother, insofar as descent within filiation, must not be allowed to interfere with ascending lines. That is why the despot's incest is twofold, by virtue of the new alliance and direct filiation. He begins by marrying the sister, but he enters into this forbidden endogamous marriage outside the tribe, inasmuch as he is himself outside his tribe, on the outside or at the outer limits of territory. This is what Pierre Gordon showed in his strange book. The same rule that prescribes incest must prescribe it for certain persons. Exogamy must result in the position of men outside the tribe, for who their part are entitled to an endogamous marriage, and are able, by virtue of this formidable right, to serve as initiators to exogamous subjects of both sexes, the sacred deflowerer, the ritual initiator on the mountain, on or across the waters, the wilderness, land of betrothal, all the flows converge on a man such as this. All the alliances find themselves countersected by this new alliance that overcodes them. Endogamous marriage outside the tribe places the hero in a position to overcode all the endogamous marriages in the tribe. There's a lot in this opening passage right away. Does anyone want to take a first crack and start somewhere? Because there's just a lot. I'll give it a try. At this point, we're now breaking down the filiative and the alliance and the way that the despot has played with them. Again, to go back to the way the filiative and the alliance was during the primitive times. It was directly the conjunctive or disjunctive. We're page number 200. I will share the screen. Apologies that I haven't been doing that. You can read right along with me. Previously, we talked about how the alliance and the affiliative function in the primitive of how society sort of organized the various flows of my desires. So I have my filiative, which is my direct family, I'm born to or born of this lineage, and we make our alliances with other people in the tribe, other groups, or tribe to tribe based on my sister and who she marries. This is a male-centric view, by the way, wholly. The nature of this sort of descent or ascent, or the alliances, are the sort of, think of it as the two axes with which we're able to start seeing how power is disruptive and plays inside of these spaces. As we move to the despotic or the barbarian or imperial representation, they break the two very cleanly into lines. First, we're going to talk, in this paragraph talks specifically about incest with the sister. Now, it's not directly literally talking about just incest with the sister, but instead talking through the nature of how alliant lines all ultimately, again, come back to this despot, this single hero, this godhead who's the one who's in charge of it. The phrasing that they use, as I understand it, and again, this is all my interpretation from the last time we went through this and re-listening to that, very particularly, the line that they use is, he begins by marrying the sister. This is not his sister, it's not a sister, it's not your sister, it's the sister. The nature of the representation of my alliances. Again, the sister is, in the primitive, she's the method with which my family is able to maintain and grow relationships with other tribes, other families, on their lineages. So we have vertically, mom begets son or daughter, begets son or daughter, begets son or daughter lineage. But how we work with people is based on who my sister is able to marry, how I'm able to marry someone else's sister and bring her to my group, this back and forth. And the despot owns this, takes this completely, and wholly owns marrying the sister, and that language is very particular. That's my sort of top line of this paragraph. Is that generally how you guys read it? Anyone have any thoughts, addendums?
So I'm reading Homo Sacer, and he mentions this idea that the way sovereignty is defined is by who gets to control, like, the exception to the rule. Like, whatever the law is, the sovereign is the person who can make an exception to the law. Is that related in that sort of the despotic machine is like the despot is the one who's able to violate the one taboo, incest? Like, might those ideas be related somehow?
I think they're spot on. I wouldn't even say it's so much even that he violates the taboo, but the exception of the taboo is what makes the taboo solid. Because Homo Sacer is a wonderful book that very much is making that point, that It's not that the exception is a thing that breaks the rule. It's that the exception makes the rule. That without such an exception and having it be blanket, the rule would be effectively meaningless. You need options for that. For murder to be illegal, you need to have moments where it's not. If it was just flat out always illegal, the law suddenly becomes completely meaningless in terms of what it does sort of with things, and the taboo goes with that. The Bataille writes exceptionally on this in Erotism, which we were doing a reading of. The way that taboos function and the exception to that is the thing that makes the taboo acceptable, especially with sex or death, which is what erotism is primarily about, at least. So I'd say spot on. And so Ken asks, what accompanies filiative, the other alliance? We'll get to that. The filiative comes next because that's fucking the mother, or incest with the mother, not the sister. This is specifically about the sister. So it's directly about alliance at this point. And that's the line, how to say, the same rule that prescribes incest must proscribes incest must prescribe it for certain persons. All the flows, and this is of alliance, converge on a man such as this. All the alliances find themselves countersected by this new alliance that overcodes them. Think about it as the despot, whoever he marries, is effectively the sister to everyone. The prince comes along. The prince is going to be our new ruler. Let's talk. We're back in despotic times. And the prince, it has been decided that he will marry the princess of France. That is the sister. All of our sister, if we're French, the French sister is being married to our son, our ruler. And so because of that alliance is sealed in a singular place. It overcodes all the other flows. Whereas before it was, I have like 2 or 3 sisters, and I mean, not to talk about them like they're cattle, but that is kind of what this is. It's, oh well, she's going to marry this guy. I've got this other one, and we'll figure it out with this complex arrangement. The despotic singularizes it down. And now when the king of blank place X comes to marry the princess, she is our sister, like the royal our sister. And by marrying her off, our alliance is sealed there. Now, in that case, also, she's his sister too, when you start considering how alliances are formed and set up. So it's gross, but it's the way to think about how alliances are formed under this new type of representation and new way of doing things with the power structure. Does that make sense, Ken?
Yeah, it's almost like there's an exogamous incest and an endogamous incest.
Yes.
Insofar as the sister thing. But it's interesting that it said the hero begins by marrying the sister, then he marries the mother. So they're almost saying that the exogamous is primary in a process or something.
They say the despot's incest is twofold. First, virtue of the new alliance, and then direct affiliation. He begins by marrying the sister, but he enters into this forbidden endogamous marriage outside the tribe, and as much as he is himself outside the tribe, on the outside of the outer limits. And then they go through and blah, blah. And then the next step is that incest with the mother is a different meaning, a different setup here. And actually, I'm going to read that paragraph so we can dive straight into it. It is clear that incest with the mother has a completely different meaning. This time it is a question of the mother of the tribe, as she exists in the tribe, as the hero finds her in penetrating the tribe, or finds her again in returning to the tribe after his first marriage. He countersects the extended filiations with a direct filiation. The initiated or initiating hero becomes king. The second marriage develops the consequences of the first. It draws out the effects of the first. The hero begins by marrying the sister, then he marries the mother. The fact that the two acts can, to varying degrees, be bound together, assimilated, does not rule out the existence of two sequences in the phenomenon. The union with the princess sister and the union with the mother queen. Incest goes by twos. The hero is always sitting aside two groups. The one where he leaves to find his sister, the other where he returns to find his mother again. The purpose of this double incest is not to produce a flow, not even a magic flow, but to overcode all the existing flows and to ensure that no intrinsic code, no underlying flow escapes the overcoding of the despotic machine. Hence, it is by virtue of his sterility that he guarantees the general fecundity. The marriage with the sister is on the outside. It is the wilderness ordeal. It expresses the spatial divergence from the primitive machine. It provides the old alliances with an outcome. It founds the new alliance by effecting a generalized appropriation of all of the alliance debts. The marriage with the mother is the return to the tribe. It expresses the temporal divergence from the primitive machine, the difference between the generations. It constitutes the direct filiation that results from this new alliance by effecting a generalized accumulation of filiative stock. Both marriages are essential to the overcoding as the two ends of a tie for the despotic knot. So, to go back to your question, Ken, it's the marriage to the princess and then the queen are seen essentially as two, one being the alliant and one being the filiative. We are talking about ultimately the same marriage. It's kings may get married a bunch of times, but we are talking about the princess being married and then the queen existing. The queen mother, which is not a term that I'm making up here, is essentially the filiative originator for all of us, including the despot, but also the fact that it's also the princess and his sister. So suddenly incest becomes possible to him because it changes the alliant and the filiative structure of all of society to be sort of through him as that central axis.
Yeah, it's like um, the despot's no is the nail around which the knot forms, or the possibility of no, right?
I like
Or
that.
an exclusion or something.
So is it then like in a Nietzschean way that he the despot is expanding his reach or his grasp through this expansion of power by taking an outside princess, so to speak, brings it back by that securing his filiative line, and then he has to integrate himself through again in this territory because he left, he exited, and he has to go back and reintegrate himself through the symbolic um, incest with the mother to make it the queen of the people.
That's how I read it, where it's and that's why they divide the marriage into twos. The first thing he does is he marries the princess, but he doesn't do so in the tribe, or it's not the same setup. He because he exists necessarily outside of the tribe, or all the tribes. Ultimately, he exists in kind of this other place. His marriage to the princess exists outside of that as well, and his return, his sort of re-territorialization, if you will, as he comes back. That second marriage is the moment when he as the king and she as the queen is recognized as the queen mother, and that sort of secures that filiative line. It's the double sort of action that happens here. It's the line they have here. The marriage with the sister is on the outside. It is the wilderness ordeal, the spatial divergence from the primitive machine. It provides the old alliances with an outcome. It founds a new alliance by effecting a generalized appropriation of all the alliance debt. But then the marriage with the mother is the return to the tribe. It expresses the temporal divergence with the primitive machine, the difference between the generations. It constitutes the direct filiation that results from a new alliance by effecting a generalized accumulation of filiative stock. Those two elements, again, the original alliant and then the filiative, is that processual nature of what these things and how they actually operate. I think that's spot on, Triad. Questions, comments, anything? Remke asks, are they one and the same marriage, just from different parts of the process? Yes, we're not talking about a king who gets married 90 times. It's literally talking about the fact that this one marriage really isn't one marriage. I mean, you could say this essentially about almost every marriage, that there's multiple stages to it, but very specifically here, there's the first marriage, which happens outside of the tribe, which is alliant and secures the overcodes the flows of debt between them, and sort of seals that, and that happens outside of the tribe necessarily. And then the second step, which is another marriage, which is when he returns, it takes on it creates sort of this accumulation of filiative stock when he comes back, and he's married to the queen now, and now you, as a subject, a political subject in this world, now you have a queen, you have a mom, you have a filiative direct thing. Yeah,
so that's
Ben nails it. It simplifies it.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Ben just nailed it perfectly. The prince marries the princess, and then the king and queen are married. He's spot on. That's a really nice way to put it, because it's not. They're different things, despite being the same person. They're different full bodies. Ken, go ahead.
I'm just so sorry to cut you off. So this is the first paralogism, right? So the despot inserts the signifier of lack, and then the signified are these meanings that you're getting out of it that you were just talking about, the queen and the princess and whatnot.
Yes. I mean, again, to go back to the thing we were discussing at the end of last week, their big argument here in all of this is, and continue to look for it, they spent the first part of the book talking about how the unconscious works, but this is not just how the unconscious works. There's a underlying sort of function and process that all things really undergo. And so when we're talking about, the conjunctive or the disjunctive, there's a reason that they utilize those terms that are mirroring the different parts of the process of the unconscious and the machinic sort of nature of it. You have I think the conjunctive is the alliant, and then the disjunctive is the filiative. And through that, desire is molded and built, and things are recorded. And this is the process of things, even at a societal level, not just in the unconscious. 100%, that's what they're driving back at. And we'll get to that. I want to dive next paragraph because I think it's a good one. A pause seems in order here while we ask how such a thing is possible. How is it that incest has become possible, and not only possible, but the manifest property and seal of the despot? Who is this sister, this mother? The sister and mother of the despot himself? Or should this question be framed in a different way? For it concerns the whole system of representation when it ceases to be territorial and becomes imperial. First of all, we have the impression that the elements of the in-depth system of representation have begun to move. The cellular migration has begun that will carry the Oedipal cell from one locus of representation to another. In the imperial formation, incest has ceased being the displaced represented of desire to becoming the repressing representation itself. For there can be no doubt, this way the despot has of committing incest and of making it possible in no way involves removing the apparatus of social and psychic repression. On the contrary, the despot's intervention forms part of the apparatus. It changes only the parts of the machine, yet it is still as the displaced represented that incest now comes to occupy the position of the repressing representation. Another gain in the sum of repression, a new economy in the repressing apparatus, a new mark, a new severity. It would be easy, too easy, if it were enough to make incest possible, and to implement this in sovereign fashion, so that the exercise of psychic repression and the service of social repression would be made to end. The royal barbarian incest is merely the means to overcode the flows of desire, certainly not a means to liberate them. O Caligula, O Heliogabalus, O mad memory of vanished emperors, incest never having been the desire, but merely its displaced represented as it results from psychic repression. Social repression has everything to gain when incest comes to take the place of the representation itself, and in this capacity take charge of the repressing function. That is what we have already seen in psychosis, where the intrusion of the complex into consciousness, according to the traditional criterion, did not, to be sure, alleviate the repression of desire. With incest's new position in the imperial formation, we are therefore speaking only of a migration in the in-depth elements of representation, which will render the latter more foreign, more ruthless, more definitive, or more infinite with respect to desiring production. But this migration would never be possible if there did not occur, correlatively, a considerable change in the other elements of representation, those elements that operate on the surface of the inscribing socius. So much is said here. I don't even actually know where to start with this one.
Yeah, it's dense shit.
Very dense. It's incredibly dense. Is it worth going back over maybe the repressed representative and all that? Or should we just jump straight to the nature of social production underneath the despot and how it sort of functions? Because I think we could spend hours doing both of these without actually even coming close really to touching on significant parts of it. Let's start with this. For those of you who weren't with us last time, where is your question? What question do you want to start with? Because I'm looking up my explanation for the displaced represented and all of that, which is a whole fucking thing. But where are your questions? Let's start with that.
I would start with, at least that's what comes to my mind first, because both of them are starting with this, is how this is related to the manifest property and the seal of the despot. Because to me, it seems that this concern, that concern of the whole system of representation with this movement from the territorial to the imperial, means to me that it is not only a representation of a specific field where the social can move, but it is this constant referring back to the despot, to his imperial representation that needs to be in every aspect of this rule, because he's, as we saw before, overcoding every flow within his reach through this, so to speak, power of incest. He's able to create through this self-referentiality the moments of constant reference to himself. So he's not allowing something to develop beyond his reach, because he is trying to integrate everything in his field of power. Well, that's very not Deleuzian and Guattarian, I would say, because I'm very much struggling with their jargon here too. So I have to translate it into something else to even make sense of it.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
Yeah, he says that the cellular migration has begun that will carry the Oedipus cell from one locus of representation to another. Is this the beginning of the Oedipal complex?
It's the wording you're using. I want to be real specific on. This is where we're starting to see the pieces of the Oedipus complex really come to formation. I would hesitate to say this is the beginning of the Oedipus complex because I don't think that they necessarily believe in that type of genealogy of things that, oh, here's the moment where it started, but instead these pieces collapse and form and new pieces grab together. And then at some point the Oedipus complex comes into formation. But here are all the different pieces they're laying out as they've talked through the filiative, the alliant, and then now they're getting into the way that the displaced representative of desire ultimately becomes the repressing representation itself. This is another one of those sort of early pieces of this that I think I would say is the early parts and start of it. Yes. Does that make more sense? I'm trying to be very careful about how I say that because I don't want to like steer in the wrong direction.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and I think I'm going to read straight from Holland here because I think he explains it pretty nicely. If you haven't, Deleuze and Guattari's Anti-Oedipus, Introduction to Schizoanalysis by Eugene Holland. Fantastic guide to this. I reference it all the time. Since subject peoples now owe their despot everything, he has thereby gained the right of access to all women indiscriminately, regardless of their former lineage or erstwhile alliance obligations. The despot is in principle everyone's father, but equally everyone's son, brother, spouse. The thing to sort of talk through here, when we talk about debts, as we talked about them before in the primitive, and now that we're talking about the alliances and the affiliative lines all coming through the despot, when we say that the despot is now owned everything, that debt is infinite, we are talking about actually the sort of dismantling of all other debts as well. So regardless of what one family owes another, or what one woman's debt is to a man she was going to marry, or vice versa, the despot overrules all of that. It doesn't. You plan as much as you want. The despot gets whatever he wants. To continue, the despot is in principle everyone's father, but equally everyone's son, brother, spouse. Hence the figure of incest, which had appeared as a mere afterimage of positive marriage inducements under savagery, now becomes, in a sense, ubiquitous and inevitable, if only symbolically, with the new alliance and direct filiation relations of despotism. But such incest is the exclusive prerogative of the despot. The right to incest is a power that sets him completely apart from ordinary mortals. One result is that incest in this royal or despotic form is no longer the displaced representative desire, but has become the repressing representation itself. I'm taking that quote. Imperial relations of anti-production are based on caste distinctions that separate the despot and his court retainers or state bureaucrats from everyone else. Incest now appears taboo for ordinary people precisely because it is the prerogative of the despot. Royal incest is still not yet the incest of every man's psychoanalytic Oedipus complex, though we are getting closer. For this form of incest exercises its mode of repression not by universally forbidding it, but by making it licit for the despot alone within a system of rigid caste distinctions. The position of the despot, then, in a literal sense, is an enviable one. He concentrates in his person the function of anti-productive expenditure for the entire empire and all its peoples, and exercises the right of eminent domain over everything they produce and reproduce. We'll get more into that, but this is sort of leading towards that, I think, pretty nicely. Did that kind of answer, JK? Because I know I was hoping to fully answer that. I'm still getting to the displaced representative. I'm trying to find my good explanation.
Yeah, thanks. That's a little bit more clear. So it seems like what was at one time a social, kind of activity that becomes gradually becomes a formation or a practice, and later on it becomes a psychological, imprint of onto the unconscious.
I think that has to do with so we'll jump to the paralogism of displacement, which is a whole critique of representation in and of itself. When they start having the discussion around the three terms, and they're really fun because they just sound the same to me, and it took me forever to understand this, and I don't even know if I do at this point. We have the repressing representation, the displaced represented, and then the repressed representative. All of this comes from essentially an edict of don't do a thing. So it's don't do Oedipus, don't fuck your mom. This prohibition against incest is the thing that is prohibited, is the thing we want. Now, how does this happen? How does this come to be? Because sort of the argument they're making is that Oedipus isn't a priori as being humans. It's not something that's innate to us. It's something that is not determinate. It's something we learn, or we are shown over time, or that representation creates within us. The method that they do this is through the paralogism of displacement, where we have on one side, let's say, the signifier of the prohibition, incest, the bad thing, the naughty. That's the repressing representation. It is a repression. It is a representation of things that we should not be doing. It's a repressing representation. That's why they use the phrase. I'm trying to simplify. That when that gets in, like jumps into your unconscious or the machinic nature of it, it creates another signified. That signified is the displaced represented. Now this why they call it the displaced is because it is a distorted image of the thing you want. It isn't literally the thing, because that's not how representation works. Instead, it's this image or this element, this signified, that is like, oh, well, that's what I wanted. The example that they give, and their arguments for this, which I find very convincing during the primitive socius, is the idea that people don't really have sisters or mothers as we know them, or as Freud knew them during the era he lived in. That during such a time, the relations of mother-son, it's not one-to-one. Large groups raised children, and often they were breastfed by aunts, uncles, non-related people, grandparents, whatever it may be. Your relationship with your mom isn't the same as it was. So they didn't really have mom, so how could they have Oedipus, don't fuck your mom? Well, the moment you say to someone, don't fuck your mom, at that point, you've actually not only introduced them the concept or the representation of mom, but also that they shouldn't do it. And so now you have this signified, this displaced represented. And this is a huge problem, because this becomes the Oedipus complex. This is this distorted image of desire. Now, underneath all of this is desire continuing to flow. Not like desire doesn't just like go, oh, cool, that's not, like desire is still going in there. And they call it, I think at some point, like a trap. I prefer to think of it as sort of flowing underneath, getting stuck, because they use the term refoulement, which is also used for the backing up of pipes or sewage, which I like as a visual. And this last bit, that what happens is actual repression isn't just this desire that I want to fuck my mom. Now all of this is trapped. This false image creates, and it is displaced ultimately on this other signifier. This is the sort of the repressing representative, this last bit. And it means that we are taking the representation and the image, and it is being placed on desire, and desire is pushing us in this direction. So it's all fucked up. Desire becomes displaced into this fucked up signified. This problem overall doesn't prohibit incest. Instead, it creates the image of incest and places desire trapped within it that's constantly pushing. And it's one of the reasons that it causes, massive amounts of neurotic, psychotic, other behaviors, to the question of the sentence that Rimke is referencing inside of this, which is, this is what we already see in psychosis, where the intrusion of the complex into consciousness, according to the traditional criterion, did not, to be sure, alleviate the repression of desire. The intrusion of the complex into consciousness, when we tell someone that they have an Oedipus complex, it doesn't fix them. It doesn't alleviate it, because we're still dealing with this paralogism ultimately. All of that is a very fucking long-winded way to come back here to what Ken was saying, that this is the paralogism, again, sort of showing its face, but we're now talking about, the alliant. We're talking about the family, the familial, the filiative, and the way that desire is sort of trapped and played with inside of that, or in this case, production, because production is the manifestation of desire inside of the second, or the molar regime. That is my long-winded fucking explanation. That's probably too much.
Thanks, that's helpful.
Was I far off with anything? Those of you who've been here, and because I'm trying to condense a whole bunch of shit we talked about, because there's a lot coming to this, and there's a lot that's being taken over by this, because we're now really diving into how things work at a societal level, how our production or desires are co-opted at a societal level, which is a whole other fucking thing now. All right. I think I'll move on to the next paragraph then. What changes singularly in the surface organization of representation is the relationship between voice and graphism. It is the despot who establishes the practice of writing. The most ancient authors saw this clearly. It is the imperial formation that makes graphism into a system of writing in the proper sense of the term. Legislation, bureaucracy, accounting, and collection of taxes, the state monopoly, imperial justice, the functionary's activity, historiography. Everything is written in the despot's procession. Let us return to the paradox that emerges from the analyses of Leroy Gourhan. Primitive societies are oral, not because they lack a graphic system, but because, on the contrary, the graphic system in these societies is independent of the voice. It marks signs on the body that respond to the voice, react to the voice, but that are autonomous and do not align themselves on it. In return, barbarian civilizations are written not because the voice has been lost, but because the graphic system has lost its independence and its particular dimensions, has aligned itself on the voice, and has become subordinated to the voice, enabling it to extract from the voice a deterritorialized abstract flux that it retains and makes reverberate in the linear code of writing. In short, graphism in one and the same movement begins to depend on the voice and induces a mute voice from on high or from the beyond, a voice that begins to depend on graphism. It is by subordinating itself to the voice that writing supplants it. There's a lot here too.
That's
leave
quite
it up.
interesting, because we just had our Derrida reading group, and that's someone who's mentioned just at the beginning of the next paragraph, and here with this graphism becomes dependent on the voice, because one of Derrida's big critiques in grammatology is that in Saussure's semiology and his understanding of the sign and of the written language is that it's just representational of another order, that it is not autonomous in this sense. It is representing the voice, the presence of something else, the phoneme, the metaphysical presence, so to speak. And it's just a vehicle for this, but not a genuine one. So by that, the graphism here in analogy becomes the vehicle for the presence of the despot, who can now reach through this medium as something like this metaphysical entity, even though some people may have never seen the despot, the king, in all of their life, for example. in a vast kingdom. He's always present within everything, and it reminded me also of the Korean written language, Hangul, which was created by a famous king there, because the Chinese letters were too complicated to be learned by all different castes of people. So he invented a very simplified version of this, so that everyone, even on the fields and in every system, could learn writing. But in the same way, it is not only something that is liberating, but through this, the people got connected more, because now they had a unified written language that is also that which now is transporting to every last part of the land the word of the despot by written letters that are then not only read in a village by someone who was delivering this letter, but they could just be placed there on the marketplace, for example, and everyone had to read the new forms of law, for example, on aspects of taxation. So everything became integrated in this reach, in the symbolic reach of the despot and its system of representation.
It's a really great explanation of it. I think I made the joke last time that in America, a very easy version of this is if I were to just type out the words, "we the people," what voice is saying it? Like it's just a simple thing. And in America, the answer is the founding fathers, everyone. No matter what I type it in, what handwriting, it doesn't even fucking matter. Just saying "we the people" in this, that's what it means. It means the founding fathers are speaking to you with a mute voice through those words, which is, when you spend a little bit of time thinking about it, it's kind of fucking wild. But it's absolutely Derridian. I like that. I've never said it that way. I like it. It's very Derridian in the setup, because I think he would just flat out, isn't it everything he said that all writing is ultimately on a voice that is absent. Yeah. And it like you said, they'll mention him.
No, it's not the only thing, because for Derrida there is this archaea writing, but that's a whole nother story. You could bring this together maybe with the body without organs and desiring machines, etc. But for Derrida, it's just this problem of looking at writing as something that is just derived from the phonetic language, because it is now something that makes assumed presence that is there and carrying some sort of truth or some sort of revelation, universality, and presence within it, that is just carried by this, and that there's no genuine way of writing of difference that is producing even this form of identity and of presence, as he says, which is archaea writing. This pure form of productive, active movement, of bringing forth traces, or traces that even bring forth this aspect of spatial differentiation and temporal deferring, by which we even can even think, or which even constitute the form of thinking in forms of identity and difference. And that there is no inherent despotic rule, for example, of the presence of the voice of some transcendental field, some lived presence in a Husserlian sense, or a metaphysical entity like a god, a king, or just a pure moment of truth that is then transformed and degenerated by writing it.
Was there a Derrida reading group this morning? Were you in that?
Yeah.
All right, there we go. Okay. It's like that's really good recall today. No, and we'll get to that. That's a fantastic explanation. Thank you. We also have a Derrida reading group, by the way, if you want to check our chats and announcements. But
Is that on this?
please.
Is that your reading on Discord and on this same channel?
It's in our partner server. The link is inside of the announcements. We have a Continental Philosophy server run by Ken and a few others here who are admins for things that are not saying Derrida is not within the scope. Some of the writings are. We try to keep things tighter inside of this server. So the Continental Reading Group has just a ton of different ones, and there's a Derrida one every Monday, I believe. Tried, am I right? Yeah, tried. Post it. There you go. That's the server.
Yeah, we are meeting right before Anti-Oedipus every Tuesday.
It makes for a long 4 hours, I'll tell you that. But Jean-Claire asks, is this like propaganda or Orwell's Ingsoc, the language of doublethink? It's less that. Think instead about how voice and language and writing operate and how they produce meaning within all the different elements of how they work. The very specific setup here they're talking about is barbarian civilizations are written, not because the voice has been lost. The voice, as we talked about before, is spoken word versus graphism, which doesn't align to any specific phonetic, but instead graphism applies to images, cave writings, symbols, deeply symbolic, versus this is a phonetic language where now I'm placing the language or the spoken word in a place of privilege by serving it underneath. But that also does this other thing, as they say. It's by subordinating itself to voice that writing ultimately supplants it, because now voice means specific things and words are utilized specific ways. And now we're suddenly in a place where it's no longer that I'm telling a story, it's that I'm reading words. And it's no longer that I'm drawing out or being symbolic in how my graphism works. I am now writing those words. There's one way to say things, one way to speak. And it's not that they are disconnected anymore. This does play into how propaganda operates, abso-fucking-lutely. And they'll get into that kind of in the next few, but that's kind of, I'd lean more that direction that they're talking about that at this point. But the next paragraph, I mean, they make the next leap, so I'll just jump to that. To Triad's point, Jacques Derrida is correct in saying that every language presupposes a writing system from which it originates, if by that he means the existence and the connection of some sort of graphism, writing in the largest sense of the term. He is also right in saying that within writing in the narrow sense, hardly any breaks can be established between pictographic, ideogrammic, and phonetic procedures. There is always and already an alignment on the voice, at the same time as a substitution for the voice, and phonetism is never all-powerful, but is also always already begun to labor and elaborate the mute signifier. He is again correct in linking writing to incest in a mysterious fashion, but we see nothing in this link that would lead us to conclude in favor of the constancy of an apparatus of psychic repression operating in the manner of a graphic machine capable of performing as well by means of hieroglyphics as by phonemes. For there is indeed a break that changes everything in the world of representation between this writing in the narrow sense and writing in the broad sense, that is, between two completely different orders of inscription. A graphism that leaves the voice dominant by being independent of the voice while connecting with it, and a graphism that dominates or supplants the voice by depending on it in various ways and subordinating itself to the voice. The primitive territorial sign is self-validating. It is a position of desire in a state of multiple connections. It is not a sign of a sign, nor a desire of a desire. It knows nothing of linear subordination and its reciprocity. Neither pictogram nor ideogram, it is rhythm and not form, zigzag and not line, artifact and not idea, production and not expression. Let us try to summarize the differences between these two forms of representation, territorial and imperial. That's going to be a big fucking thing real fast here. So I'm going to stop there. It's a lot of that was actually just expanding on what we sort of just talked through. What questions does anyone have, please? Ask away. Jean Claire asks, is there an example of this idea? They're going to be getting into examples. How do I even say? It's not really possible for us to go back and think about it because we live in a place where this is kind of already done and assumed. The link between writing and incest, they will absolutely, well, specifically between the Oedipus complex, not necessarily incest, but how representation works is, again, what we're really discussing here. It's not so much incest that they're going back, oh, people want to fuck their moms because of writing. Not so much. The Oedipus complex and the way that it displaces desire and fucks with desire, specifically in what they're getting at here. So to go back, they're talking in this last end of this paragraph, the primitive territorial sign is self-validating. It is a position of desire in a state of multiple connections. The primitive territorial sign is pre-connection of language, not even as we understand it, where people can read out a story as they look at it. I think back to Stargate, and they have all the hieroglyphics, and he's reading it like it's a tale, as if it's all words. That's not quite how that operates. This is long ago a symbol that was drawn, cave wall, graphism, whatever. This is directly connecting because it doesn't touch language, it doesn't touch meaning, it's not translatable. It's directly connecting to the things that it has to. It is pure image without voice, I think is a way I'd describe it. Does that make sense to anyone? Is that acceptable, or am I saying stupid shit now? Triad?
It's not bound yet to a specific structure of representing the voice, because it's more vaguely playing with concepts and images, like in as Jean Claire wrote, that these images are invoking stories, connections, but they are not expressing them in a very linear form, like a law text, for example. You have then in the big religions of our time, where you can find this very intriguing structures of abstract laws and voices that are made present again.
Yeah, they call it this like self-valid. It's a sign. It's not a sign of a sign or a desire of a desire. It is the thing, and it's almost I don't know how else to say it. Someone would apperceive it instantaneously. There's no hey, I'm looking at I've got my bottle of water here, and I see on the symbol it's that symbol, and I know what that means. It means Dota. I'm drinking from my Dota water bottle, which is this game, which is this thing, which is a representation of representation. There's layers to words, layers to written word or spoken word now. It's a sign of a sign of a sign of a sign, or a desire of a desire of a desire of a desire. This shift from the primitive, which is direct fucking desire, boom, right there, hey, it's there you go, to signs of signs is a significant shift. And it's only through this are we able to get to the point where the repressing representative is able to even operate.
So you're saying it begins with these desires that are there already structures in the and in that oral tradition, but then it becomes reinforced in the written language. Like becomes a mythology. At first it was in the oral tradition, but it becomes written down. with the language at a later date. But then there are already like mythologies of these structures, right? And
Well,
that's
Right.
how
yes.
is that how the oracles are also absorb them, and into those oracles they continue to promote these truths about these despotic structures.
Right. In these territorial representations, we have already some sort of mystical understanding and thinking, something that is more vaguely concerned with magical causation, with images, and some cults of fetishes. So in this mystical thinking, there is not yet this notion of mere representation of something that is just a vehicle for something else, or just a symbol. For example, an image of a person, even though it may be not very realistic to our eyes, or of some animal, is used in rituals, is something that is invoking all kinds of stories, that is used and not only read. It's we have still in our society some reminiscence of that, because we still don't tend to for example, step on a photography of a person we know, because we associate it with this person, and we would think this is a bad omen, or then maybe something bad happens to this person. So you would not spit on the image of a loved one, or an effigy of them. But in this more imperial representations, things become unified, because people, for example, invent forms of bureaucracy. It really doesn't have to be a full developed written system yet, but maybe it's something as accounting, and something like simple signs that lead um, your way in the city, or stuff like that. So you have these more unified and framed expressions and units of sense that now become um, related to a very enclosed central system of a despot that overlooks this rule. So you cannot express yourself in this sense very freely, very poetically, in the sense of creating new forms of sense and meaning all the time, but you have to refer to to already existing form of rules, of conventions, of taboos that are constantly present in this society, and shaping every form of sense making, and referencing, and production of meaning. At least that's how I explain it
It's
to me in
100%.
this.
It's spot on. Another way to describe it, because again, it's tough for us to talk about, because we live in a place where writing and words and spoken words are already like intertwined. But let's say that I wasn't going to record this audio. Let's say that I were to. Here's what we're going to do, guys. I've got this AI program. What it's going to do is it's going to record us and transcribe us into written word, and then we're going to translate it into another language and then back. That process through the entire thing, if we're aware of it, and we would be, I'd tell everyone, the language you'd use would be very different. You wouldn't, make guesses or say things that are overly complex. You would necessarily make sure that what you're saying can be communicated, because it's important that the end result, the thing you produce, the process that ends, is the thing you want. If that's the case, let's pull back, because you're already doing that. Everything I'm saying necessarily for sense making to be done relies on generalized signification of all the words I'm using to the words you're using to the words anyone else is using. Now that over time can switch and change, but when you add writing to that, and when the voice sort of becomes, as they say, subservient to this, and when writing becomes subservient to it, to the voice, writing actually supplants it. Writing becomes, this is the word means this, and suddenly you have a muted, sort of displaced voice from on high that's speaking it, and the words that are used at any given time are related back to that writing. And so it keeps us inside of a very specific system of representation that we're even allowed to communicate within. Just like my weird nightmare thing, we're here talking and using language. If we were to be translating this or putting it in written word, it changes everything. And we are doing that sort of at a base level. And we need to be like, that's their argument that they're coming to, is like, this is the challenge, is now we're talking about representations of representations of representations of representations. And that's not good. That's not good for us. It gets us to a place where we have signs of signs of signs of signs, layers. And this is how we get the displaced represented. That without this process, the Oedipus complex couldn't exist as a repressing mechanism, which it is. And that's the sort of argument through a lot of this.
It seems to control. Oedipus seems to, I don't know, displace one's desire, control one's desire, whatever, through controlling memory. Like, so, because, you know, what the psychoanalysts are getting at and what Deleuze and Guattari are talking about seem to be pretty similar. It's just there's a spot at the beginning that Deleuze and Guattari don't like. And that spot at the beginning is that one's desire is the desire of the other. So one's desire is marked by this traumatic moment where there's a difference between your body as, you know, this thing that you haven't placed any signifiers on yet, and then your body as an object of desire for the other, as a name. And so then there becomes like a split there between the word and the thing, and then that split repeats itself through the rest of the process. The issue there is that, I mean, it seems common sense that like the most traumatic thing, so even if their idea is that like trauma dictates development or something like that, in the broadest sense, that doesn't have to be like the like, it seems like the most intense trauma would be the one that dictates it, not the earliest per se. But so that's the problem, right? The process is the same. So you get deterritorialization and reterritorialization with both, but marking that surface with a specific code, with a no, so that difference between the word and the thing ends up being the mother's desire, right, in this line of thinking. And then the mother's desire is supposed to be like for the father or for something else. And that's like the difference between what Freud's getting at with the penis and the phallus. And
well, real quick though, I just want to add, because I think you're right. For them, when we say memory here, though, they're talking about inscription.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, same.
So it's very much them driving towards how these memories operate, how they work, how signification even operates. And I know you're in our Logic of Sense groups, and anyone who's been joining us through this or the last read through of this, the creation of those singularities and partial object connections that allow us to have the signification, that allow these large tapestries of meaning and sense to sort of be produced. It's all of these things are ultimately an inscription process or a memory creation process. I'm going to go use the restroom. I'll be back in 2 minutes. Please continue, Ken. Yes, I would say inscription and recording are the same, Raven.
I mean, speaking of Logic of Sense, they're saying, let me pull it up. Bodies. So, and if I recall correctly, they like sort of say that bodies are like, they pair bodies with causes. So it's almost like in this despotic mode, graphism becomes the cause of the voice, or the voice becomes an effect of graphism, like y'all were saying about these representations and signs on top of signs, because you get this overcoding. So that's an interesting bit. And I guess graphism just is also generally alluding to this coding process. Is that right?
Is graphism, like if you apply it to logic of a sense, would that be the state of affairs? Uh, you know, uh, Seems like they would be the cause of the incorporeal, but the propositions, it seems like they have aren't the propositions the signifiers? So wouldn't graphism be the signifiers of the incorporeal, the propositions? Yeah, it seems like
I wish I could answer your question, but I can't. I'm like a little bit familiar, but I ended up dropping off with the group.
yeah, there's a kind of a relationship there with this. Mm.
Did I miss anything?
JK had a question.
Please.
Because in the logic of sense, there's a kind of circularity when it comes to the language and the use of propositions, right? Between signifiers and the signified and the state of affairs and denotation and manifestation. So there's a kind of circularity there, and that isn't graphism. If we're thinking about graphism in this context and apply it over to the logic of sense, isn't that where graphism operates in that kind of circularity mode, circular mode?
That's a great connection. That is a great connection.
Yeah. So it's like that circularity is like kind of like the trap of language. What they're talking about here. How process of representation and territorialization. Just trying to draw some connections.
Oh no, it's I think it's spot on, and the field of the transcendental field in logic of sense, I think, which is the field in which all of the singularities, which are single points of contact that make up the series, are very much the BWO. Like a lot of logic of sense, you can see a lot of the early thoughts and the early understandings of these things. But that's a great connection I hadn't even made. It's fantastic. I do want to move on to the next paragraph, which is going to go through a lot of actually what we just discussed, but in their language, to talk through the two forms of representation, how it shifts from the territorial to the imperial, because I think it'll help continue this discussion that we're having. In the first place, territorial representation is made up of two heterogeneous elements, voice and graphism. The former is like the representation of words constituted in lateral alliance, while the lateral is like the representation of things, of bodies, established in extended filiation. The former acts on the latter, while the latter reacts on the former, each element having its own particular force that is connoted along with that of the other, so as to perform the great task of germinal intense repression. What is repressed, in fact, is the full body as the foundation of the intense earth, which must yield its place to the socius in extension, into which the intensities in question pass or fail to pass. The full body of the earth must assume an extension in the socius and as the socius. The primitive socius covers itself in this manner with a network wherein one is continually jumping from words to things and from bodies to appellations, according to the extensive requirements of the system in its length and its width. What we call the order of connotation is an order in which the word, as a vocal sign, designates something, but where the thing designated is no less a sign, because it is furrowed by a graphism that is connoted in conjunction with the voice. The heterogeneity, the divergence, the disequilibrium of the two elements, vocal and graphic, is resolved by a third element, the visual, the eye. It might be said of this eye that it sees the word. It sees it, does not read it, insofar as it evaluates the suffering caused by the graphism. Jean-Francois Lyotard has attempted to describe such a system in another context, where the word has only a designating function but does not of itself constitute the sign. What becomes a sign is rather the thing or body designated as such, insofar as it reveals an unknown facet described on it, traced by the graphism that responds to the word. The gap between the two elements is bridged by the eye, which sees the word without reading it, inasmuch as it appraises the pain emanating from the graphism applied to the flesh itself. The eye jumps. To read the footnote, Lyotard reestablishes the overly neglected rights of a theory of pure designation. He shows the irreducible gap between the word and the thing in the relationship of designation that connotes them. By virtue of this gap, it is the thing designated that becomes the sign by revealing an unknown fact as a hidden content. Words are not themselves signs, but they transform into signs the things or bodies they designate. At the same time, it is the designating word that becomes visible, independently of any writing reading, by revealing a strange ability to be seen, not read. See Lyotard, Discourse, figure, page 4182. Quote, "Words are not things, but as soon as there is a word, the object designated becomes a sign, which means precisely that it conceals a hidden content within its manifest identity, and that it reserves another face for another view focused on it, which perhaps will never be seen." End quote. But which in return will be viewed in the word in itself. There's so much there.
It's a complicated way to say that the despotic machine controls what you think by predefining the thing.
Yeah, essentially by having the words and all of that, it's no longer that we're dealing with the thing directly, but instead a once or twice or 10 times removed sign of the thing that, itself no longer has the direct power of the element itself.
So would an example of this be the construction of the categories of like nature versus artificial, and the ways in which we like construct nature and the world as like a standing reserve, I guess, to use the like Heideggerian terms, of something that's related to the socius rather than sort of its basis or its body.
Well, so specifically with this, the thing they were going through in this is the territorial representation that dealt with voice and graphism. And we have to remember, we have to go back to the sort of theater of cruelty, the reality of cruelty that is inscription in this time. Because, as we talked about, when someone comes of age and, they're going to be made into a man or woman or whatever their role is, the debt that they now or will forever owe their tribe is literally carved into them. The graphism happens on the body. And this is why they keep using the phrase in here, the I, and they keep coming back to it. It evaluates the suffering caused by the graphism. This element in the sort of territorial time is what is the witness of that is essentially the payment of debt, or the reality, the agreement. The I is part of this, that as it's carved in, as I'm scarified, that I'm going to be a warrior, that I'm a man in the tribe or whatever, forever, everyone remembers this, but if I don't experience the pain, I haven't learned it. And so that back and forth, the seeing of the word, the element that it's again, not reading it, but evaluating the suffering, evaluating the real, evaluating the understanding that the person being inscribed upon has of the reality of the system, the gravitas, the power. This is the important part that the I does. It kind of goes away a little bit, we'll say. But that drive that they're pushing back for is this direct connection that once was had between the words I said, there's no words written, but the spoken word versus graphism, and the direct sort of connote. I hate that word. They use it so much. That's literally pointing at the things. That's how I understand it.
Yeah, I meant specifically the section where they say, like, what is repressed is the full body as the foundation of the intense earth, which must yield its place to the socius and extension. So is that like a way of like making it so that the body of the despot's the only thing that's visible?
Or the bodies of the tribes or each other, because the socius that is sort of pushed underneath, that ultimately does maintain and fall back on all production and become that thing, it's important that the full body sort of be taken apart. How to put this? God, it's a really good question of how to phrase my response to that. How to phrase that response to that? So, the underlying socius, the thing that is responsible for production, or that all production gets assigned to, the full body of the earth in the primitive, the full body of the despot, and the imperialist or the despotic. What is important is that, I'll just quote directly, this element must yield its place to the socius in extension, into which the intensities in question pass or fail to pass. The intensities being the elements, or the division of things, I suppose would be a way to put it. The full body of the earth being everything needs to ultimately be divided in order for us to, break things up, in order for us to have discussion or really cognize or even make sense of elements. It's not to go back to difference and repetition, but this is kind of like really what a lot of that is about. And so the socius being the full body being the thing that's repressed, but instead the socius being this sort of element that comes out of it that is there in extension, is the thing which, again, takes care of all production and eliminates that. The phrasing they use here is to do this, the primitive socius covers itself in this manner, with a network wherein one is continually jumping from words to things and bodies to appellations, according to the extensive requirements of the system in its length and its width. The system being my essentially direct things that I'm related to, my affiliative or my alliances. They're the things I'm able to see. My sisters, my mother, my tribe, the people around me, the debts that I have are all right in my area. And this network is me jumping from words to things, but not from words to words to words to words. For example, it's very, very much directed. The separation here is when it starts making that next play where we become disconnected, and suddenly the elements of which we'll get into. I don't even think we've gotten to the despotic yet, because we're still dealing with graphism at this point and just purely the territorial. And it's this element. I'm going to read the next paragraph. I have to. Sorry. I'm going to just jump to the next paragraph, and hopefully I'm able to answer your question there, Raven. Sorry. The magic triangle with its three sides, voice audition, graphism body, eye pain, thus seems to us to be an order of connotation, a system of cruelty where the word has an essentially designating function, but where the graphism itself constitutes a sign in conjunction with the thing designated, and where the eye goes from one to the other, extracting and measuring the visibility of the one against the pain of the other. Everything in the system is active, inacted, or reacting. Everything is a matter of use or function. So that when one considers the whole of territorial representation, one is struck by the complexity of the networks with which it covers the socius. The chain of territorial signs is continually jumping from one element to another, radiating in all directions, emitting detachments wherever there are flows to be selected, including disjunctions, consuming remains, extracting surplus values, connecting words, bodies, and sufferings, and formulas, things, and affects, connoting voices, graphic traces, and eyes, always in the polyvocal usage. A way of jumping that cannot be contained within an order of meaning, still less with a signifier. And if incest seemed possible to us from this point of view, it is because incest is nothing other than a jump that necessarily fails, this jump that goes from appellations to persons, from names to bodies. On the one hand, the repressed this side of appellations that do not yet designate persons, but only intensive germinal states. On the other hand, the repressing beyond that only applies appellations to persons by prohibiting persons who answer to the names of sister, mother, father. Between the two, this shallow stream where nothing passes, where the appellations do not adhere to the persons, where the persons elude the graphic actions, the graphic action, and where the eye no longer has anything to see or evaluate. Incest, the simple displaced limit, neither repressed nor repressing, but merely the displaced representative of desire. From this moment on, it appears indeed that the two dimensions of representation, its surface organization, with the elements voice graphy I, and its in-depth organization, with representing instances of desire, repressing representation, displaced represented, share the same fate, like a system of correspondences in the heart of a given social machine.
Can you scroll? Oh, thank you.
So we're still in territorial. We haven't moved out of territorial yet. We're still there really talking through how the direct connections, and they use the term conjunctive, polyvocal, a lot of things, because to them, the way that they're describing this, people dealt very cleanly with desires as desires were, and the sort of direct extensions of such things. I'll shut up there, and please, Ken, go ahead.
Well, I just have a question mark, just a pure question mark in that last sentence that starts with "and." Whenever they say the repressed this side of the appellations that do not yet designate persons, but only intensive germinal states, and on the other hand, the repressing beyond that only applies appellations. So the first side, what is that? The repressed this side of appellations.
So the two sides of this element that they're talking about, this side of, and then on the other hand, this side of appellations that do not yet designate persons, but only intensive germinal states, they are, how to put, look, someone has to answer mother. That's the other side. But I have to have someone to call mother. I have to have someone to call sister. I have to have the relations that are enclosed by such a form, and they're not. Instead, they are intensive germinal states that are very open-ended and kind of go the direction they do. They don't designate a person. I call my son Dexter. I don't call him son, but very often you'll hear people say, or especially the more traditional types, yes, son, very well done. Oh, mommy, I'm Dexter, mommy, daddy, everything. It's normal in that sense, but like that's because we made him call those such things, and we've again triangulated. I'm a terrible father, I guess. I don't know, but the thing is, in these societies, they don't have such things to call. There's no such thing as a mother. It's an intensive germinal state, the one who gives birth and who cares for. But that shifts, just like the wasp and the orchid, who at any time can be becoming the other. An ant can be playing the role of what we know as mom by breastfeeding or taking care. The mom could go off and decide to, do whatever the fuck she wants. It's not a relative state in the same sense that we have it. And that's the one side. The other side is you need the person who's going to answer towards that and who sees themselves as such a thing. Those are the two sides as I read it.
Can we equivocate partial objects and bodies here?
No.
Okay. Well, I was wondering if it made sense to put partial objects or desiring machines on one side and then the name or the word on the other side. So you have mother is non-signified thing, and then you have the name of the mother on the other side.
I think you could say the unconscious on what, like, if we want to talk about where the line and the sides are, I think the subject is what they're talking about. I think the line would be that the me experiencing subject. So on the one side you have the machinations of the machinic unconscious. On the other side you have the molar representation of desiring machines within the socius. On my side, yes, you could say desiring machines with partial objects connecting, but when they refer to full bodies, this is the argument they made very early on, is that partial objects are not full bodies, and nor do they have an understanding of what a full body is. The desiring machine doesn't want mom. It doesn't even know what the conception of such a thing is. The full body or the body of the mother or anything like that is a representation necessarily. And so on the one side you have, they say it goes from appellations to persons, from names to bodies. On the one hand, you have they don't designate persons. That's where they're saying desiring machines, but only in intensive germinal states. But a body is a full thing. It's I want mommy, I want whatever. Desiring machines don't have that. On the other side, I would need someone to call that, and there's no one who calls themselves that or would answer such a call. Those are the two sides. Because representation doesn't even work like that. I can't call anyone, they're not a mom. That's not how it operates. The word and the way representation operates gives us mothers as a whole body, as a thing, as a representation that I'm able to refer to. And if I say, hey, everyone, how's your mom doing? Everyone here has a person they immediately think of and cognize as mom. Or if you were to say, I'm going to call my mom, there's a person you're going to fucking call. Or dad, or whatever it is, however it may work out. There's a person you're going to call and you're going to set up. That doesn't exist inside of this because, again, the way representation works inside of these systems doesn't play in the same way. Roles don't have the same place. Words don't have the same meaning because they're not written. They're not specific. They're not limited to the way that we sort of have fucked them together, basically.
Yeah, but the way we fuck them together has an effect, and it does limit, and it does create roles. So then, I mean, maybe not a question to answer now, but it sounds like what you're left with is just naming, like territorializing your desire, like naming it something other than what it's already been named.
I actually don't even know if we could even imagine what it's like to be able to have language that's not tied directly to, like, a spoken word that's not tied to a language or a structure that's so deep as written word. It's why it's when we go through the partial objects and talking about, that's why I always go back to the metaphor of the baby who has no language. And I think it's why psychoanalysts always do too, but like a baby doesn't sit there and go, excellent, where is mother? Give me the breast. They just are grasping and connecting and remembering, and the sensations being recorded over time allow them to sort of form. Oh, this person I call mom. Mom is breastfeeding, rearing, bathing, person walking, driving me around. Like, all of those things become what mother is, but they all get captured within what mother is, because that's the nature of sort of representation in the written word. They're all mom. Mom's the one who does those things. It's difficult. I tend to be the one who works, and so it's been tough to have that be the case with my kid. I want to spend time with him and bond and, you know, spend some time eating, take him out. Mom's the one who does those things as far as he's concerned. And because of that, mom means those things. And that's a little bit different than the way it would be without such a system of representation. That's my reading. I do want to continue in the next paragraph, though. I'm 99% sure we are not getting through this one today, so this is going to be a longer one. Hope all of you join next week, because this is a longer one. So we just finished. I'll read the ending. From this moment on, it appears indeed that the two dimensions of representation, surface organization with the elements of voice graphy I, and its in-depth organization with representing instances of desiring, repressing, representation, displaced represented, share the same fate, like a system of correspondences in the heart of a given social machine. Now to continue. All this finds itself overwhelmed in a new destiny, with the despotic machine and imperial representation. In the first place, graphism aligns itself on the voice, falls back on the voice, and becomes writing. At the same time, it induces the voice no longer as the voice of alliance, but as that of the new alliance, a fictitious voice from beyond that expresses itself in the flow of writing as direct filiation. These two fundamental despotic categories are also the movement of graphism that, at one and the same time, subordinates itself to the voice in order to subordinate the voice and supplant it. Then there occurs a crushing of the magic triangle. The voice no longer sings, but dictates, decrees. The graphy no longer dances. It ceases to animate bodies, but is set into writing on tablets, stones, and books. The eye sets itself to reading. Writing does not entail, but implies a kind of blindness, a loss of vision, and the ability to appraise. It is now the eye that suffers, although it acquires other functions. Or rather, we are unable to say that the magic triangle is completely crushed. It subsists as a base and as a brick insofar as the territorial machine continues to function in the framework of the new machine. The triangle has become the base for a pyramid, all of whose sides cause the vocal, the graphic, and the visual to converge towards the eminent unity of the despot. If we call the order of representation in a social system a plane of consistency, it is evident that this plane has changed, that it has become a plane of subordination and no longer one of connotation. And here, in the second place, is the essential. The flattening of the graphy onto the voice has made a transcendent object jump outside the chain, a mute voice on which the whole chain now seems to depend, and in relation to which it becomes linearized. The subordination of graphism to the voice induces a fictitious voice from on high, which, inversely, no longer expresses itself except through the writing signs that it emits. Revelation. This is perhaps the first assembling of formal operations that will lead to Oedipus, the paralogism of extrapolation. A flattening out, or a set of biunivocal relations that leads to the breakaway and elevation of a detached object and the linearization of a chain that derives from this object. Mostly explaining, I think, what we've gone over, I think, quite nicely as well. Does anyone here have questions, thoughts, comments, please? Or maybe no one has any questions.
So this subordination of writing to voice is basically Derrida's idea, right? Also,
Right, yeah.
Can anyone articulate how graphemes might relate to the abstract machine? Is there any sense there?
Nope.
Because it doesn't seem like literally like writing though. Like I get the flavor of like the general notion of law, which is like the also this notion of like coding, where yeah, it's like written, but there's also like this implicit, prohibition that floats around in strange situations and whatnot. And then the abstract machine is what's between the orchid and the wasp. Does that sound right at all?
I, I'm trying to be quiet, so I'm trying to force Triad to talk because I think Triad has a better grasp of this. To me, a lot of what they're starting to get into now is pulling again from Yelmslev. I don't have the greatest grasp of Yelmslev in general, but when we're talking about a lot of these things in this direction and his view of how language develops and graphemes specifically um, function within his semiotic hierarchy, I think there is a lot of connections here, but I don't have enough of a I don't have enough
Well,
of a
that's something we kinda discussed in the Derrida group today as well. But Kent has a very better grasp of Yamslev, but it's a critique of Yamslev that Jacobson and Derrida at the same time bring forth, although Derrida is also criticizing Jacobson, but Yamslev is forcing linguistics in this uh, structure that he builds, this very algebra of language, as he calls it, and this glossosemantics he is developing is just looking at language in this very virtual form as a set of rules of functions of forms without any aspect of substance or concrete expression, although he is constantly using the term substance and expression, um, but in another way. So he's not referring to how language and especially the voice is generated in what context. So everything becomes just this logical and formal structure and is following a set matrix of rules and of places where stuff is and gets its meaning from. And that's just bracketing out the concrete genesis of the uttered voice, for example. And that's how, um, for example, then the written language is just reduced to a set of rules, to something that is preset and not constantly developing in a game, uh, in a spiel, and creating new forms of meaning and sense all the time. And that's something that goes over to the written language as well, because this is just representing the voice now, the voice of the despot, what his decree is, what is traded in the country, what is declared relevant. And there is not this free flowing and constant breaking and re-emerging of forms of sense um, anymore, because everything needs to be integrated in this larger system. As they write here, this magical triangle is just now a foundation for this pyramid. Everything is striving for this top point in the hierarchy and is leading to it. Even if they don't want to, they are constantly forced back into it, because the graphisms cannot dance in this aspect. And I guess that's some kind of foreshadowing why Deleuze later finds so much interest in the arts, because the percept and the affect are something that are not under the rule of the concept in this plane, and of the organization of the organic in this form of something that is constantly structuring and forcing its own rule on the molecular machines that are inhibited within it and forced to work for it.
And I would say I love all of that. I think even Yomslev would say that Deleuze's take, which is ultimately that it's not so much that Yomslev is trying to make things too structural. It's that the nature of having these things insistent upon each other and the nature of the apparatus that produces meaning within the language as we use it, the written and spoken combination, is by nature itself problematic in that direction. I think Yomslev even talked at length about how the first thing we need to understand is that the written/spoken word language is in Problema of Language, he talked about how language is linear. And he contrasts that to the way meaning is derived is one thing insists on the next, on the next, on the next, on the next, on the next. And he very much got into this idea of sort of talking about how what would a radial language be? The same way there's mathematics that works, that you can go in that direction and have radial meaning, but that we don't have that option. And I think he even used cave paintings and graphisms from the primitive Socius. He didn't call it that, but from that time, he used those as examples of radial meaning. Cave paintings where you could start anywhere and go anywhere else, which, again, that's why Yomslev gets mentioned a lot in Mille Plateaux. But I think that very much translates into Yomslev-y stuff. I love Yomslev's sort of take on that, but I thank you for that explanation, Trad.
Yeah, and I guess this image of the pyramid is very important here, and that they both, so Deleuze and Guattari, both use these almost geometrical terms because everything becomes flattened in this manner, or flattened on the voice, so things just fall together, become way less complex, way less creative, and or in relation to which it becomes linearized. So these things are not anymore free floating, as you said. In these images, you can go in any direction, create new forms of meaning. No, everything becomes linear, and that's something then media theorists like Marshall McLuhan point out in his Gutenberg Galaxy, that with this creation of such despotic systems in this anti-Oedipus terms of, for example, the written language and their mechanical reproduction in the times of in the newer times, the thinking of the people becomes different as well, because they are conditioned to think in this linearized form of the written text, and that something needs to be that a text just needs to represent a form of spoken language, and every text that doesn't do this in our cultures in lineage of the Indo-European language root is something that is seen as utter nonsense, or just pretentious artsy stuff, for example, that is just playing with language and not carrying any meaning.
Fantastic explanation. Any questions before I read this last paragraph, and then we'll do a discussion, and then we'll probably close out for the day and continue next week. So any comments so far, questions, please ask. Fair enough. It is perhaps at this juncture that the question, what does it mean, begins to be heard, and that problems of exegesis prevail over problems of use and efficacy. The emperor, the god, what does he mean? In place of segments on the chain that are always detachable, a detached partial object on which the whole chain depends. In place of a polyvocal graphism flush with the real, a biunivocalization forming the transcendent dimension that gives rise to a linearity. In place of non-signifying signs that compose the networks of a territorial chain, a despotic signifier from which all the signs uniformly flow in a deterritorialized flow of writing. Men have even been seen drinking this flow. Andres Zempleni shows how, in certain regions of Senegal, Islam superimposes a plane of subordination on the old plane of connotation of animist values. Quote, "The divine or prophetic word, written or recited, is the foundation of this universe. The transparence of the animist prayer yields to the opacity of the rigid Arab verse. Speech rigidities into formulas whose power is ensured by the truth of the revelation and not by a symbolic or incantatory efficacy. The Muslim holy man's learning refers to a hierarchy of names, verses, numbers, and corresponding beings, and if necessary, the verse will be placed in a bottle filled with pure water. The verse water will be drunk, one's body will be rubbed with it, and one's hands will be washed with it." End quote. Writing, the first deterritorialized flow, drinkable on this account, it flows from the despotic signifier. But what is the signifier in the first instance? What is it in relation to the non-signifying territorial signs when it jumps outside their chains and superimposes, a plane of subordination on their plane of immanent connotation? The signifier is the sign that has become a sign of the sign, the despotic sign having replaced the territorial sign, having crossed the threshold of deterritorialization. The signifier is merely the deterritorialized sign itself. The sign made letter. Desire no longer dares to desire, having become a desire of the despot's desire. The mouth no longer speaks, it drinks the letter. The eye no longer sees, it reads. The body no longer allows itself to be engraved like the earth, but prostrates itself before the engravings of the despot, the region beyond the earth, the new, full body. Ken, you got anything to say about the master signifier and Lacan at all with this one? Feels like it's squarely pointed.
Yeah. Yeah, it is.
Yeah, I just like this, how they kind of broke down, because they started in the sort of, again, the territorial socialist, and now moving to despotic, talking through how desire manufactures meaning, how manufacturing meaning changes meaning, and ultimately how signs become dependent on the system of writing, which once again moves things to the despot. And now we can have a conversation of, yes, the master signifier is a thing. Here's how this works. Here's where this comes from. And it feels like it's almost directly talking to Lacan and Lacan's entire semiotics or concept of signification. Am I far off?
No, I mean, I think it hits the masculine sexuation diagram to a T, where you need some sort of exclusion that you make transcendent to be able to like justify your own position. So man only exists insofar as the woman exists, but we all know what Lacan has to say about that, right? But so what a master signifier can do is it can maintain a chain of signification even whenever the signified is missing. And that's this part about drinking the letter and whatnot. So a more down-to-earth way of doing this is where people become, spokespeople for movements they don't fully understand, I guess. So what you're doing is just propagating a prohibition and a rule. And that's sort of what's organized your voice, if you will, is a prefigured inscription that's meaningless. And the only thing that holds it together is because I said so.
Well, and part of that also is the earlier part they say here, the territorial chain, a despotic signifier from which all the signs uniformly flow in a deterritorialized flow of writing. This idea that our universalized conception of our writing is deterritorialized and presumes that like a master, better for lack of a better term, a master signifier, a despot that announces these are the meanings. This is where we start from. The chain of signification begins with me. That process is fascinating. And a really great way to sort of talk through how meaning sort of becomes generative in these chains of signification.
I mean, and I'm just curious how they would then respond, because, I mean, the chain of signification for Lacan begins with the difference between the name and the image.
So my guess, and I don't know if they actually do directly confront such a thing, but my version of that for them would be it's not that it's about the representation of the image and how that is ingested by the machinic unconscious, and that the machinic unconscious, how it takes things in, how the eye operates, the process of all of this, depending upon the recording structure with which things are ultimately recorded, is what will determine this process. We will go on. There is no, like the way capital works, or the way these things sort of work as we sort of move on, will continue this. But their argument very early during the territorial is, no, there is no master signifier. That's not even how this operates. It necessitates to have these 90 things, these hundreds of little bits that are all functioning and producing in themselves, and also this power structure that's very particular, that relates meaning in these very, very particular ways through representation, that is what allows the master signifier to be a thing. So I don't think they would say that Lacan's necessarily like wrong in that. It's just that it's not, again, determinate, that it instead is cultural or built by the sort of situation or the growth of the person, depending on the socius that they're in, based on generalized repression and how representation plays within such things.
Well, that makes sense, and I'm still not so sure there's as big of a disagreement.
Well, I don't think there's almost any disagreement.
Well, there might be, because I don't know if the difference between like the name and the image is a representation or is not. I mean, it sort of is. So you fantasize about the difference between like the person and their name. Like, so you know me as Ken on here, and I'm sure you've thought about at some point in time who I am. But there's going to be a difference there between what you think about me and then like how I'm actually connecting to things in my life and whatnot, right? So I think they still could be agreeing, because doesn't deterritorialization come first?
Well,
Here.
I do think that generally they're going to be agreeing, and it's not a shock given that Guattari, again, studied under Lacan. But a lot of what they're talking about here is very specifically that we have the image or the sign, and desire no longer dares to desire. Instead, it becomes a desire of desire. It becomes sort of impotent for its own desire, and that separation of the thing. It's the core activities that we have are no longer there. The mouth is not the thing that speaks. Instead, it drinks the letter. The eye no longer sees, it reads. It's about the ingestion and taking in of meaning rather than the production of it, I think, is a big thing that they're pointing at here. And I don't think Lacan would fight any of that. I think he would disagree in some of their other points. But I think this is Guattari's way of saying, actually, here's why you're right in our time, and here's how this got produced, in the same way that they would never say that Oedipus complex doesn't exist. They would say, but wait, it's not determinate of the human condition. Whereas I think Lacan very clearly would say that desire is desiring the desire of the other is determinate of the human condition. They would say, no, that has to do with the power structures and working of relation of representation. That would be, for me, that's how I would piece it.
Yeah, I don't think Lacan believes you can participate in like the Holocene without being castrated always already. And so And so that's the big difference, is that I think maybe Lacan thinks he's a realist in starting from there, whereas they're like, no, you don't have to start from there, and um, maybe you don't even have to approach that particular issue where your desire becomes the desire of the other, like you're talking about, where what you're desiring is already another's desire. Um, so you don't have to start with the difference in your mother's desire or whatever.
Yeah, and so as things are placed in front of us in this system of inscription, because again, everything we have in the despotic is owned by the despot. Wives, mothers, land, people, all the stuff is not mine. The debt is infinite. All belongs to the despot. As this marries sort of the because there's no economy to that. That's just everything is indebted. It's the way it goes. As everything is placed inside of this power structure, and suddenly my filiative and my alliant forms of everything is completely fucked. Now, when I have desires, because I'm seeing them, not seeing, I'm reading what they are. I'm reading what needs to be done. I'm not directly ingesting them the same way that I would via an abstract grapheme, for example, or a painting or a cave drawing. I'm not taking it in the same way. Instead, it's very aimed at. And this is the thing that you want. This is the thing of what it is. And it's defined cleanly. If we go to logic of sense, I think logic of sense, JK earlier brought it up and connected it. We're talking through, I think, almost identically this stuff in logic of sense. Join us next Monday. Because as we talk about signification and how meaning is made and how these things are produced inside of different times, like this is that stuff. This is that. This is so interesting.
I mean, what's interesting to me is how it seems like you can't fully get rid of the despot and the pull of the paranoiac.
Not as long as the representation is stuck within power structures, I think would be the implication of a lot of this. And we'll be talking very quickly into the next paragraph. That's been 2 hours. The next paragraph is a fucking really long one. I think it's the entire next page and a little bit more. I want to make sure that we get a chance to fully read it. We will continue it next week, because where they're going to get into is talking about literally, I think the first sentence of the next paragraph is, no water will ever cleanse the signifier of its imperial origin, like the signifying master or the master signifier. Pretty much exactly what you just said, Ken. You're never getting rid of the despot now that we have language, as we know it.
So he's in agreement with Nietzsche that there's no way to get rid of the power structure, right? It's part of nature itself. Right? It's part of our nature.
No. So specifically, they're saying that the power structure as we have it, by coming about through the despot, here is how it was produced and here is how it's structured. It is not determinate of the human condition. It was simply not a thing that existed in the primitive socius. So it is not a thing that is expected or a thing we have to deal with. It's a thing we have to deal with now, because in order for us to have signification within our current socius, these elements have already been brought together, and we must now think of ways to sort of break them apart or move them apart to other things. So I would not say that they would agree with Nietzsche in that power is like not a thing we can get away from, but I would say they would like partially agree and say specifically, as we know language now, as things exist now, these systems and how they produce things and how the power structure within these things produce meaning is actually the trap for desire, ultimately. That it is the thing that pushes us towards the paranoiac, the way language works. I gave this talk, and I still believe it. Video games, as we know them now, are reactionary, and they do the same thing. Every video game that you play tells you very quickly what you're supposed to do and how you're supposed to do it, and very tight controls. There's not a lot of creativity. You don't have a lot of possibility space in the vast majority of games. As such, they lean towards a hyper-paranoiac reactionary audience, which I shouldn't surprise anyone that that's the fucking case after Gamergate. The way that these things function pushes people towards that, but it's not inherent to being human. It's not inherent to video games. These are the way structures are developed and built, and this is them breaking it all down. They will get to, and in chapter 4 is very long, and we will spend a great deal of time on it, specifically how we can break down our understanding of representations to change how power is structured within it, and to actually get back to this idea of desire being able to desire, which we aren't allowed to do anymore. Sorry for the ramble, JK. That was my answer.
But according to Nietzsche, and I think Deleuze agrees that in order for you to escape from that kind of power structure, it's up to the individual to channel that kind of power, will to power, in some kind of a artistic or creative endeavor. Right?
Yes. So if you're looking at will to power as desire, or an analogy for desire, or Newman, or however you want to phrase it, libido, 100%. Like that's where they for sure connect, at least in
Right.
my eyes, for sure.
Right. It is to free up the unconscious and away from those corrupting despotic power structures.
Which they believe is representation in general as it operates today, which is a hell of an enemy, to be frank. As far as enemies go, there's a lot of representation around. Any last comments or questions? And we will go to next week. Leave it open for 10 seconds of silence. If anyone wants to jump in, now would be the time, and then I'll cut out.
Hey, thank you, everyone.
Yep. Thank all of you very much. Next week, please join us. We will continue from the bottom of apparently 2M. I hate this fucking PDF so much. 206. We will continue from the bottom of 206. 2M.